We have an incredible set of guests today. So, first off, really quickly, again, I'm Alex Sarlin. We have Sharon Dunn, who is the head of brand partnerships and project manager. She is behind the scenes here helping this webinar run. And Jen LaPaz, our operations lead at EdTech Insiders, who has been instrumental in setting this up and marketing it. And more importantly, we have incredible guests today. Mick Hewitt is the co founder and CEO of Ednition. He will tell you all about it. David Hinkle is a distinguished engineer at Securely, incredibly innovative company using data in truly life or death safe ways in education. And Stephanie Kaufman, head of product at Talking Points. But I will tell you a little bit, but I'd really like each of these guests to tell you a little bit about themselves. So let me start with you, Mick. Can you tell our audience who you are, what Ignition does, and a little bit about your data story?
Yep, that sounds great. Thanks, Alex. So at Ignition, we're working to lower the cost of rostering for EdTech vendors and help them say yes to every type of district integration. So my co-founder and I have been in the EdTech space since 2008, been working on this problem a long time. Working with data. Our former business, we started an assessment company that was acquired by Instructure, the makers of Canvas. But this whole interoperability and rostering, I would call it a saga. We'll go through that history today. Has been just part of our lives. And one of the things that we've really noticed is, EdTech developers and companies repeat this process over and over again, and the landscape keeps getting more complicated. So our goal is to simplify that for everyone, and also reduce those costs. So we'll talk more about that, but that's a little bit about my background.
It really is a complicated landscape. And what we'll look into a little bit today, but as somebody who's done product and ed tech, who's done instructional design, man, this rostering stuff, it can be tricky. But when you get it right, it can be transformational. David, how about you? Tell us about Securely and how you're using data.
I'm David Hinkle. I'm a software engineer at Securely. Securely is a student safety company. We provide student safety and wellness products like internet filtering, classroom management, and suicide prevention. I think our most interesting use of data is getting authorities to a student who might be suicidal before they can act on their ideations.
And what you need very particular data points to be able to do that, David. Tell us a teeny bit about that.
Well, the most important data that we need to be able to do that is we need to know where the student is at, right? So we need to know where the student is at on the weekends. We need to know where the student is at during the week. We need to know who their parents are so that we can reach out to those people. We need to know what counselors are assigned to them. And we need visibility, beyond rostering, we need visibility into their documents and their, conversations.
Yeah, it really powerful and a little bit scary, but incredibly important use of data. Stephanie, tell us a little bit about your work with Talking Points and how you use data.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm Stephanie, head of product at Talking Points. At Talking Points, we are an EdTech nonprofit, and our mission is to drive student success by supporting districts, schools, and families to build positive relationships that help improve student outcomes. And so it's important for us to have lots of information about families that are helping with this student, that are helping support the student's academic success and the outcomes that are driving student success, such as attendance and academic data.
Yeah, and that extended data is something we're going to talk about a lot today. So to kick off today, we're gonna really start delving into some of the incredibly important, as Mick says, the saga of how rostering has evolved over the last few years. It's gotten more complicated, it's gotten trickier, but it's also gotten more standardized in some ways that can be beneficial to everyone here. So let's kick it off. Mick, tell us a little bit about, grounding ourselves in the mountain of infrastructure that every ed tech company needs to learn. Sometimes we in ed tech, we say, we have a great idea to improve learning, let's do it. And then you hit this wall of, now I need to know what LTI is. Now I need to know what SSO is. Now I need to know what OneRoster is. Tell us a little bit of how this works.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thanks to David and Stephanie. We work with Talking Points and Securely in helping with their infrastructure, providing data and rostering. Just great partners to work with. But yeah, Alex, we put this on the screen as just like all of the things you have to think about as an ed tech company or entrepreneur. And usually we get our first phone call when it hits the point in a startup's business where they say the district says you need to integrate with our systems. And that can mean both the SIS from a rostering standpoint, as David and Stephanie need more than just the core rostering data, the who the students and teachers and classes are. But then it gets more complex, right? Because you get to New York and they want you to use like OpenID. You get to Gwinnett, Georgia, they want you to use SAML for single sign-on. So, and then we'll get to this more, but then you get to the learning management systems that the district wants you to integrate with. So again, this mountain is wide and tall, but all of us repeat the same thing over and over again. So that's kind of where we really set out as we experienced this firsthand to say, let's help people, get to the top of the mountain faster, really skip to the top of the mountain as quickly as possible is the idea.
Absolutely. And it's something we see in a lot of other industries, right? When in the medical world, and there are these standards that have to be used to make sure all the systems talk to each other in ways that are beneficial for the end user. We in EdTech have sort of evolved these standards over time. So tell us a little bit about the old days. How did data used to be transferred
Yeah.
before some of this?
And Alex, in our prep for this, you mentioned, we've got a wide variety of folks in the audience. So probably, expert people who understand this down to people this may be the first time. So we wanted to start real basically with what is this rostering and interoperability? And it really starts with the SIS. SIS have been around a long time. They are the system of record. You mentioned like medical records. There's a system of record in med tech. There's a system of record in ed tech. I still remember the stories. My dad's a history teacher. My sister's a history teacher. Another sister that's an English teacher. But I remember in 1998 them using an SIS for the first time, right? And really all of this evolved around, the ecosystem began with the student information system. So we really started with what we call core rostering data. When we say core rostering, we're really talking about who the teachers, students, classes, sections, enrollment, some of that basic information that we need to say, just get our EdTech application up and running. So and we'll dive into that some more. Systems evolved, right? Districts then had a lot of these ed tech applications. So they started needing tools like single sign-on systems, right? Because if we have multiple applications, it's really hard for students and teachers to remember all the passwords. So now we've got to do this. So that system has to talk with the SIS, and my ed tech application has to work with the district single sign-on system. And here on the screen, some logos that are probably familiar, because every district has maybe Microsoft, Google, Clever, ClassLink, OpenID. They're a Microsoft Active Directory shop with LDAP, or they're using SAML, LTI for launch from the LMS system. So those are some of the common ones, right? And then we saw the evolution of the learning management system kind of hit K-12 especially, right? And we'll talk more about where that came from, but that needs to talk to the SIS. It needs to work with the single sign-on, and it needs to work with these ed tech applications. So you can see now we get a bigger picture of what does interoperability mean with all of these systems working together and data going in between them. So, with the LMS, we've got assignments, grade passback, deep linking kind of things. On the SIS side, but beyond core rostering, Stephanie will talk about extended data like attendance data, or David's talking about, being able to access the guardian address information or where the student is at. So we talk about these data augmentation use cases. So that becomes the more complex world here.
This is incredibly helpful. And yes, as Mick is mentioning, we can see from the chat, we have some very sophisticated data, data people in the audience. But for somebody like me, I am a product manager. I know, I've had to work with these types of systems. It is so helpful to understand what is where, how they're connecting, and some of this alphabet soup of SIS, SSO, LDAP is incredibly helpful. So let's move a little forward. Tell us about how rostering works today.
Yeah. So rostering, so we like to use the term rostering has now more of a broad definition. So the bigger term we use is interoperability. A lot of people shorten that to rostering. We like to talk about it in terms of these kind of buckets where we have the simple data of core rostering, that could include augmentation, right, on a student record, like, is this student an IEP student? Some of our standards, like OneRoster, don't include some of these things, so we have to do data augmentation. SSO integration, extended data that Stephanie is going to talk about, LMS integration, and data augmentation. Maybe open, before we go into history, Stephanie, David, love for you to talk about your companies and what those needs are for. Stephanie, maybe start with extended data and what that means.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. I think we're going to talk a lot about the data outside of OneRoster. At Talking Points, we need some additional information just about the student and their guardian. Similarly to Securely, we need EL status for students. We need the home language that parents are speaking in their home. So additional data that's not part of that original standard. And as our goal is to help improve student outcomes, we really need to understand where students are with those outcomes. And so we have really spent a lot of time on extended data domains, attendance being the first, but to understand attendance data, we're using that information to be able to send a message home to families when their student is not present in school or has missed a period that they were supposed to be in. We're sending information into schools to say, hey, these students have been absent so many times that they're versioning on chronically absent or truant, and be able to give schools the ability to intervene before a student becomes truant. We're helping to provide um, an open conversation about absence reasons, being able to have schools and families work together to truly understand what the barriers are to that student being in school, whether that's at a big picture level for the entire district or just a single student, to be able to resolve that and figure out how the community can come together to get those kids to school. So those are just some of the things that we're working to do with our application around attendance.
Yeah, and David, before you start, I think, I'd encourage everybody here to sort of mentally be mapping what Stephanie is saying to your own use case, right? There's data that is sort of comes through the main pipeline. What are the classes? What are the teachers? Who's in what class? And then there's additional data that might be incredibly valuable and useful for your company to deliver the kind of value that Stephanie's talking about with Talking Points. Every company has their own particular melange of what that data is. So I think
And
it's worth
Alex, just to
giving
jump in there,
thought.
in this age of AI right now, we're just seeing companies right now have this insatiable appetite for all the data. Because you can have chat bots and things for tutoring, but really for AI to be transformational in EdTech, you need more data about how is the student performing? Are they absent? All of these types of things, right?
Yep,
And we're just seeing more and more demand for that type of data.
absolutely. David, I'd love to hear your take on it as well.
I think my take here is that when we're talking about this data from the SIS, the core rostering data and the OneRoster standard, we're really talking about the table stakes data. And I think we're all really grateful to ClassLink for championing this standard and getting it throughout the industry. But you know, because they've done a good job of packing that up and setting up distribution technologies for it and getting all the SISs to support it, most of your time and energy is going to be spent on getting that one extra little piece of data that you need to handle your use case, right? And for us at Securely, that extra data is typically like who the parents are and what their addresses are, right? That's the piece that's always challenging for us. And I think every ed tech company that's trying to figure out a rostering strategy needs to figure out what they're going to get from that core OneRoster standard, what they can get by exploring extended standards like EdFi, and then what they're going to have to, engage with an expert like Mick on. When we needed this address data, Mick was the guy who showed us where to get it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a sort of tiered strategy. You get as much as you can through the standards, and then what is that one piece of data or what is that set of data that's going to make a huge difference for the value that you're adding, and how do you get it? Because it's just not always clear. And Adnition is a company that focuses exactly on that kind of thinking. So Mick, let's talk about a little bit of how we got to this moment and what you've mentioned a few different things. Oh, OneRoster, EdFi. Let's make sure that we these class length, these data exchanges. Let's talk through some of this just to make sure that we understand how we got to this modern era.
Yeah, I love telling this story because, like I said, my dad's a history teacher. Love history. So going back in time about technological history, I love as well. So kind of weaving into this story as well, we kind of have a pendulum shift that happens. So we'll start this story with, what I call rostering's Big Bang, meaning that the SISs were born, right? Late 90s, early 2000s. And then you had lots of new EdTech applications, in this universe is kind of the idea of the Big Bang is once we get the SISs, this universe of applications needs to orbit around it and access it. And we'll talk about, how integrations happen then versus, 2012, we get the picture of, your Clevers come in, ClassLink evolves, right? And then the game changes a bit, right? In 2015, when One EdTech launches OneRoster, and we see that taking hold. So we'll go through a little bit about that, the pandemic era and modern rostering. So, rostering's Big Bang was, in the early days, we were doing mostly CSV transfers. So meaning what a spreadsheet is, right? Getting that from the student information system. So the key point here is we had low levels of automation, lots of errors. It was highly inefficient. We did see early standards start evolving, like something called SIF you might have heard of. So the school's interoperability framework. So we made an attempt to do some automation, but for the most part, we were still doing very basic spreadsheet stuff. And I brought an example of what that looks like in case you haven't seen. So this is a modern day spreadsheet using a OneRoster format, but imagine back then, having just the students, the district, the schools, the students and teachers all in one spreadsheet, kind of coming at you as an ed tech company that you have to take in every night and figure out what are the differences between what I saw yesterday, right? And maybe you're only scheduling this once a week and your automation is, or once a week, once a month, twice a year kind of automation that's going on. So that's what that looks like.
I think we should jump in
Okay.
and just say because we are in such a privacy aligned world right now, we should stop and take a second to say that that was example data and those were not real students.
Yes,
Yeah.
very good. Thanks, David. Everything I'm showing today is just example data and not production PII. So thank you for doing that. So going back to our pendulum here, in those days it was very much the integration relationship was really between the ed tech vendor and the district and that SIS, right? So that's really where the pendulum was. So ed tech vendors got to control what was going on. They were able to develop this relationship with districts and that trust that happened. So segueing a little bit into, Alex, what you wanted to talk about, which is just the data exchange era is next on the list, right? So what is a data exchange as we get to kind of the 2012 era? So to describe a data exchange, we mostly think of data exchanges like a Clever, ClassLink, and some others, but we have a student information system and our EdTech application. So originally we were flowing rostering data from the SIS to the EdTech application, right, in the early days. Then we had this invention of a rostering data exchange, right? So this middleware, this middle sort of system that's going to aggregate and consume all that district data. So roster data goes, and so what these exchanges did, they was suck up data from all of the different districts, A, B, and C, right? And then provide it to the EdTech application. Now, as David just mentioned, ClassLink took the approach later on after the evolution of Clever of saying, we're going to use OneRoster and we're going to give EdTech applications that data for free. So as we take away that leg of the stool where we're going through the data exchange, what becomes really important is that data schema. So ClassLink chose OneRoster. Clever chose to do a proprietary standard, sort of building this walled garden or gated kind of mechanism in the space. Clever also charged a data toll, as part of doing that data exchange. Clever went into districts and gave districts free single sign-on tools, which was hugely valuable to districts. Then Clever had application partners pay to connect to Clever, and schools used Clever to approve what data is shared with apps. So that's really the evolution of where we get to that data exchange era, where the pendulum really goes to, who's controlling this relationship really becomes this third party, right?
Right. That's what caused us to want to change direction at Securely is Clever has this relationship where they sell to the schools, but then they ask the vendors to pay, right? So they want to provide all of their value add to the school districts, but then they want the vendors to pay. And because they don't really have a good relationship with the vendors, they want us to pay a lot. Like I think Securely decided to change direction when we were projecting like $1 million a year in Clever spend was coming, right? And that's when we decided that we needed to do something different.
That's a great point, David. I'll say at Talking Points, we still work with Clever happily because we want to meet districts where they are. And those costs are really tough for a nonprofit like us to be able to swallow. And we want to be sure that those costs are under control for our future as we scale. And it's really tough to see a path for that.
So just to talk about there's as the data exchange era happened, we had things that really worked. The huge benefit was we went from the days of those CSVs to improved automation, right? We could get this through APIs or application programming interfaces, right? And the districts really benefited from things like these single sign-on tools because the ecosystem had so many new EdTech applications that were coming into the market, right? Again, our downsides are vendor costs exploded, as David and Stephanie just mentioned. We get into an era of proprietary standards. EdTech vendors still had to build a lot of infrastructure. You go back to that map of all the stuff you have to do. Getting who the students and teachers are as that core rostering data is just a thin slice of what you really have to do for infrastructure, right? Is the idea. So in 2015, we really have this idea of open standards taking root. So it used to be called IMS Global. We get one EdTech into the picture. So this pendulum can start swinging back, meaning that, OneRoster is going to open up this highway system of vendors working again directly with these districts in a more automated fashion and in a standard way. So one of the things that happens, though, is that does push more infrastructure to the vendor side, right? Because we have to deal with this data, even though with data exchanges, we still have to do monitoring, observability, change detection, all these things, right, that are built in. But during this period, we also see kind of a growing negative sentiment, as you've heard David just talk about with the costs. This data exchange idea becomes a bit of a tax in the industry with a proprietary standard and this middleware in the middle that's pulling that data. I want to segue into David, who's a distinguished engineer there at Securely, maybe talking a little bit more about OneRoster that really, has gained so much maturity in the market. We see it now, and we'll get to this, but about 80% of the SIS market is supporting OneRoster in some way, shape, or form, right? That we can get to this. So, David, do you want to talk a little bit about OneRoster? And I do have examples of that data too, just so people can be familiar with it and see it.
OneRoster is the standard right now, right? Like it is the standard. Like if you're going to support anything, you're going to support OneRoster. It's a little bit slim in my opinion. It includes like the table stakes data, as I mentioned before, things like who the students are, what classes they're taking, who their teachers are. It's missing a lot of data from the broader ecosystem, like Stephanie will talk about later. It's missing attendance data. It doesn't have address data, which is the key thing we need, which is a little bit weird. I understand why not have address data, but its place in the ecosystem is they did a great job defining the table stakes data that almost every company needs, right? Every company needs this data. And they did a great job defining a standard for how that data could be exchanged. There's two primary methods. We won't talk about them on the call, but there's a CSV, there's a REST API. They're really well defined. As compared to the other big standard in the field, which is EdFi, OneRoster has much more adoption. EdFi is much broader. They standardize a lot more data sources, but a lot of the EdFi data sources on, products that implement EdFi don't even provide all those data sources in many cases. And EdFi never standardized a transmission technology. So OneRoster is really the standard that like everybody's going to work from. And so it's Securely what we do is is we use OneRoster as our core standard inside of our organization when we're shipping data between all products. And when we need additional data, we augment the OneRoster standard, which does have what they call their metadata technology that allows you to augment a OneRoster records with additional data.
We have a relevant question coming in. It's do you see OneRoster expanding its standard to include more data elements? I'm curious if you have
That's a
an
great
answer to that,
question.
David.
You know,
Yeah, so
actually,
go
I
ahead,
actually
David.
asked Mick that question today, right? You know, in this world where we're seeing like all this privacy push, I'm worried, like, are the headwinds against the organization that maintains OneRoster, or is it pushing back against standardizing a wider variety of data? And so I'll leave it to Mick to answer. But yeah, that's exactly a question on my mind too.
Yeah, so some interesting things going on. I think that, we're members of OneEdTech, and there's some great groups working on this. There's something on the table right now called FRM, or Family Relation Management, that is a proposition to the standard to include those things like guardian information, that is possibly being released in 1.1, kind of backwards compatible to 1.1. So there is constant work going on. And maybe just to clarify as well on the EdFi side. So one of the ways we work is, we'll go after data. We'll connect to a data exchange like Clever, if that's like Stephanie, like that's what our customers want to do, right? And provide the infrastructure to do so. Obviously have all the connection adapters to deal with OneRoster APIs and CSVs. But on the EdFi side, no matter what you think of EdFi, maybe with their work at state levels and those kind of things, Michael and Susan Dell Foundation did a really great job defining a schema in the industry for all of the other data. We think attendance, discipline, academic record, all of
Schema
this
is
stuff.
really nice. Schema is really
So,
nice.
so when we think about that data, one of the things we like to do in working with our partners like Stephanie is normalize to that, because we have to pick something, right? And there's a standard there, so there's no need to invent another proprietary standard. We work with talking points and we give them attendance data in that EdFi standard. We actually, because of the volume of this, Stephanie can go into, we use a Kinesis stream, for example, because there's high volumes of data. Rostering data tends to be, you get updates, a student goes in and out of a class, those kind of things on a daily basis, but attendance is very voluminous, right? And so we have different methods to sort of provide this data.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Sophie.
Yeah, at Talking Points, we want to take action in our platform on that attendance data as quickly as possible in near real time. So it's really important for us to be getting those events, like Mick mentioned, through Kinesis, so that we can take that information and quickly provide guidance in our platform.
And we do that throughout the day, Stephanie, right?
Yeah,
Like
all day.
that data
All
is
day,
being
every day.
provided all day as the students are going to each class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I encourage everybody who has questions to put them in the Q&A. That's the best way to communicate within this format. But I please do put them in. We are very happy to take questions, and I think it's really relevant to making it useful for everyone here. So yes, so we're coming quickly into the modern era. Let's talk about the pandemic and how we get to 2025 and what rostering looks like today.
Modern era, right? We go from we see the pendulum shifting back, and the pandemic really accelerated some of this, right? Because LMS adoption was huge. I was actually in Instructure at the beginning of the pandemic and sort of saw the beginnings of that, and the acceleration. So, with students and teachers working at home, they really needed a delivery mechanism for all of the tools and the assignments, right? And quizzes, assessments, everything. But also that really pushed EdTech companies to think more about this interoperability. Also, we had more EdTech companies come into the market, right? So we had this kind of surge and this demand increase for vendors to kind of reclaim rostering and integrations on their own. And we kind of had at this point, right, these fragmented systems and escalating costs. As we showed you before, it's not just core basic rostering we get from like a data exchange. There's much more to this solution. So as companies began to scale and expand, or new companies coming in, we saw a big push and sort of a surge for interoperability. Getting to the modern era, kind of like 2021 kind of time frame, You know, again, we've seen a real maturity of standards like OneRoster. As I mentioned, we have major support from all the major SISs that allow us to go direct to these SISs and get the data. We've got, you know, we can do this in an automated fashion. Companies like us, you know, are providing off-the-shelf infrastructure to be able to manage this on your own and in a private labeled way. So you maintain that relationship with the district, right? And you're giving them tools that you can say yes to anything, whether it's, you know, Gwinnett County, Georgia, they want to use SAML, or whatever a district is wanting. You know, in an RFP, you've got to be able to say yes. You have to have the infrastructure to do this. David, you know, I'd love to bring you in here as well, because we're doing a lot with AI and automation, and that's really changing interoperability as well. And one of the key areas we're using AI is CSVs still exist in this world. We go back to the old days of CSV transfer. That is still a baseline for data transfer in this space, right? SISs support it. With AI automation, we can take those arbitrary CSVs and quickly map them to common standards like OneRoster or EdFi, right? We launched an MCP API where you know, you can have an agent basically create new connections to these SISs, for example. So a lot of new things coming in, something David and I are actually working on to really automate these processes. Stephanie, you look like you might have had something to say, so I'll let you go in. David, we'll love your thoughts on the modern rostering era.
So I think AI is really going to change this, right? I mentioned that now that we have, you know, third parties like Adnition that have basically built this beautiful like super highway to get the OneRoster data, that costs on getting that core data are driven so low now that our costs are now dominated by getting that extra little bit of data that we need. And one of the big problems in EdTech, one of the big challenges is usually your partner on the other side of the table at the district is very frequently, especially at a smaller district, is very frequently not an engineer, right? You know, it's a teacher doing their best to do a data extract for you and then set up a CSV upload, which is completely outside of their expected expertise, right? So one of the ways that we're looking at AI right now is basically an agentic AI. Now, Mick already mentioned that they built some incredible tech into their stack already, where we're using LLMs to say, okay, well, the teacher gave us their data extract. The teacher made some mistakes in the data extract, like the fields are named wrong, or the capitalization is wrong, or they put a space in it, or the CSV format isn't perfect. You know, it's using spaces instead of commas. You know, already there is that AI tech in the Adnition stack that can map that, and just basically the AI will write code to just fix that data extraction, right? Which is a great first step. And I think our next big step that we need to take is we need to tackle that long tail of tiny districts with non-standard data sources. And we need to provide them with an AI agent that will just like walk them through it. Like, okay, well, what's your SIS? Well, this is the data extract we need. Here's how you send it. Okay, I'm looking at your data. I see you made a mistake. This is the mistake you made. You need to click on this, this, and this. All right, send me the data. Okay, I see the data now. There's some problems with the data feed, but you know what? I can just fix that on my end, write some code to fix that data feed, right? Um, that's, I think, what is going to be our next step in this field, because we really need to really need to drive that onboarding cost to near zero in order for us to be serving smaller organizations.
So true.
That's a great point, David. I think it's, you know, we're talking about vendors being able to have that relationship with their districts again. And that can be time consuming and expensive, that back and forth. And so it's really exciting to hear about the work that you guys are doing. Um, I also think off-the-shelf infrastructure is a huge benefit for talking points in particular, and that's one of the reasons why we've been working with Ignition. We want to focus our engineering efforts on our core competency, right? On our mission and being able to support student success. And many of the things that we would have had to do or would in the past have done are distracting from that. And those enablers, being able to depend on Ignition and for those enablers is has really allowed us to focus.
Yeah. I think, people I'm sure are recognizing, scenarios in what you're all saying, dealing with small districts where you have a well-meaning but not, expert data partner on the other side, or wanting to focus on, as you're saying, Stephanie, not feeling like your engineering, might is getting pulled into these data extractions and cleanup when you really want to be doing product development, or you want to be serving students directly as much as possible. We have, before we move on to talking about some of the, the real details about how this is all working in practice, there's I think, an important question in the chat that I'm sure many people are thinking about, which is that, given OneRoster, so the question is, I'm planning to use EdLink for SSO rostering and grade passing for both universities and high schools. Is that what EdNition offers? And if so, how is the service different? So a feeling of, with all these open standards in place, it makes things easier. What is exactly is the role of a third party like EdNition in improving all the schemas? And Mick, I think this is obviously a question for you.
Yeah, obviously, love to talk to that person. Obviously, there's competition in the market these days. Great respect for the team there at EdLink. Doing similar things, right? Tackling the broader set of interoperability challenges is what we are doing. One of our key philosophies is, this market, the market we're in supporting EdTech vendors, shouldn't be based on proprietary standards, right? We should not have that being a lock-in mechanism where vendors can't either, build this on their own if they think that's more cost effective, or go to another infrastructure provider, for example. So we really go into the open standards idea because we think this market should really compete on service, right? With a standard like OneRoster, we should have the highway system built, and then it really comes down to, which company can serve you best. So my answer would be, we'd love to talk to you, and schedule some time. And yeah, we're excited that there's competition in this market, and that we're there, there's folks wanting to solve these infrastructure challenges.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can see from the history of this space, what keeps happening is that, the standards develop, but then there's still missing pieces, and there still needs to be additional work. And then different players come in to try to figure out different ways to get
Yeah.
the additional work to happen.
I think the
And
most
then it
exciting thing
levels
is
up again.
we're now at that maturity of OneRoster, that we can have this more focus. Again, that pendulum swing back to vendors owning that conversation, owning the relationship with the district, and really lowering the cost for everyone in the industry. As we talked about, this, that was the goal of these standards, is to really lower the cost in the industry. And that might segue really well into kind of like what we see ed tech vendors wanting today. Number one, they want cost efficiency at scale. Rostering can no longer be seen from an accounting standpoint as a cost center. We really need to make it a growth area for companies that, as Stephanie's doing, using data to solve these challenges and be about teaching and learning. We see that EdTech vendors want the control, both control and flexibility of owning these integrations. But we also see they want tools that, in our last company, we spent tons of time trying to build. As Stephanie said, like, you get caught sort of focusing on infrastructure when you want to be building features for your customers. We're focused on providing observability tools. I always say you wouldn't dream of having a cloud platform without tools like Datadog and CloudWatch, right, that are monitoring those systems. So, people, you can't take for granted, like, with your interoperability stack, you've got to have observability monitoring. What happens if a district, deletes 10,000 enrollments and they send that data through? You've got to have change detection mechanisms that stop that bad data from hitting any of your applications, right? You've got to have alerting systems and workflow systems with your teams to be able to handle all of these things when something goes wrong. So that's one of the major things we see, and what we focus on as our customers ask us for new things.
I think that's like the
Dave.
biggest thing that's easy to miss. Like, if you're building a startup right now, like, that I can't kind of stress enough. Like, you're building a startup and you're doing your first SIS integrations. Like, you're probably thinking, oh, hey, OneRoster is a standard. Hey, I can just like hook up to this, so I can access these REST APIs directly. And you're not wrong. That's exactly what I thought when I first cracked this open, right? But then you're going to discover that like a big portion of your customers just accidentally like messes up their whole SIS integration once or twice a year and like nukes your data from orbit. And then you're not just going to be able to say to them, oh, hey, like you nuked this, so you have to fix it, because they don't have these skills, right, on their side of the table. So there's a lot of stuff that you don't realize that you're going to have to build. Like you're going to have to build some sort of circuit break mechanism that notices that a huge quantity of bad data has suddenly started flowing, and puts the brakes on the system, right? And so like pay attention to this slide if
I,
you're
I
just getting started.
I always like to say rostering, and even more than that, we say rostering in the umbrella term. Rostering and interoperability is deceivingly complex. You saw as I went through that diagram of like, then it leads to this, then it leads to this, then you have to integrate with this, and these systems have to talk to each other, right? And then we need tools to monitor and observe this. That's where the passion comes from for me, is that we experienced this in our last company, and it felt like just such a distraction to what we were trying to do. That's where maybe this last point is, vendors want a complete integration stack. That's what we see, from SSO to LMS integration we talked a lot about extended data and augmentation today. It's beyond the basics is what vendors need in modern day. When you think about those early days of, 2020, when things were first, SISs were first being invented, and we were shipping CSV to EdTech applications. The ecosystem is much deeper now. And, also just a compliment for OneEdTech. OneEdTech's meeting the challenge too, because OneRoster isn't the only standard, right? They're maintaining things like LTI and QTI, right, that are allowing these exchange of information or assessment types and these kind of things. That's really important. So I want to make sure we promote OneEdTech as well.
Yeah. And one thing that strikes me as you show the sort of history of this space is that history is also sort of the modern equivalent of when somebody starts an ed tech company. They start with CSVs because
That's
they're
right.
working with a couple of pilot
Then
districts.
they get to a district that says, we need an integration with you, and can you do this?
Exactly.
Yep.
So we have a question in the in the chat, which I think is a great one. It is, oh my God, I'm the startup. I'm exactly the startup that you're all talking about that's wrestling with these questions. Struggling so much. They're a 3-person team. Can you help me? So obviously, the can you help me part could be a separate conversation, but I would love to ask all of you just quickly to say,
Yeah.
if you are a small startup right now, you're not at scale yet. What is the number one thing that you would watch out for as you build? David, I think you already are speaking to this. There's things you are not going to have to build that you might not see coming. But I'd love to hear, Stephanie, I'd love to hear, as a nonprofit, you'd have to figure this out from scratch. I'd love to hear each of you talk to that.
Let's start with Stephanie.
Please, Stephanie, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, welcome to the party, first of all. It is really, this is Mick just spoke to, it's deceptively complex. And you don't have to learn it all yourself. There are lots of experts out there. The standards are there. The Ignition team is there. Definitely give them a call. It feels hard. And if you want to be able to really focus on your core competency, turn to those who have experience with this already. And then, like I said earlier, meet your districts where they are. I think that's the most important part, right? Do they already work with vendors? Do they already have the data that you need being exported somewhere? Like, dig into some of those questions and really figure out where where those districts are and how you can best leverage the data that they own. I think privacy is something that hasn't come up too often earlier on this call, but is a huge part of what you have to be thinking about. I think starting off thinking about standards like SOC 2 and ISO, those are things that as a startup you really aren't thinking about at all. But then once you do have to answer to those, to security and data privacy policies, you've got to go back and really rethink about those things and how those are represented in your system. So think about those now. And again, you've got lots of experts in the field. Reach out to us. We're here to help.
Yeah.
And maybe before David jumps in, the shameless plug is we're definitely here to talk to you. And more than that, be consultative about it. And there's, other companies in this space that are doing it, but, to say we'll be, talking about, getting a ClassLink account and supporting that SSO. We're certified partners with ClassLink, right? When is it appropriate to use a data exchange and when is it good to go direct? Happy to even talk about those security things. We are SOC 2 compliant and attested and audited. But like they've said, Stephanie said, it's table stakes. Happy to give you some primers in that as well. We work with our startups, to help them really get the knowledge they need to go forward in the industry. Definitely don't do this on your own, would be my suggestion if it's not us. There's solutions out there. You don't have to go at this alone. That mountain we referred to in the beginning, don't climb that on your own. There's folks here to help.
So I'll
Yes,
go
and
ahead and close this with, Stephanie mentioned the SOC 2 thing, and I think that I want to double underline that, right? You're going to have to be SOC 2 if you want to spell into this space now, just to meet the compliance requirements of most of the customers you're going to be dealing with, which means you're going to need all SOC 2 vendors, right? Because you can't meet SOC 2 compliance standards for your customers if you're using non-SOC 2 vendors. So you're going to need a data partner, right? Like an Adnition or an AdFi. We chose Adnition at Securely. You're going to want to organize your engineers around an internal standard, right? So I would suggest taking a look at OneRoster, take a look at AdFi, pick one. We picked OneRoster at Securely. Build all your internal systems around that internal standard, and then use like a third party like Adnition or AdFi to marshal data in and out of that standard as needed. Because you're gonna have some customers who say, oh, we're not doing anything but Clever, because that's Clever's model, right? They sell customers on this idea that they should refuse to work with anybody if they don't support Clever. And their idea is, because of that, we can charge way higher fees than the actual quality of the service we're providing, right? You're gonna end up dealing with ClassLink, which are much better partners, right? Their fees are much more reasonable. Their situation is much, much more standardized, easy to work with. But they're not going to cover, they're only going to cover a fraction of the school districts you deal with. You're going to have to deal with Power School. You're going to have to deal with SISs you've never heard of, right? So you are going to need those three things. You're going to need a SOC 2. You're going to need SOC 2 vendors, including SOC 2 vendors. You're going to need an internal data standard that your engineering team lives and breathes. So everybody on the team needs to understand. So pick OneRoster, pick AdFi. I like OneRoster. And then you're going to need a partner to help you marshal all of these different types of data sources in and out of that standard, because it's going to completely overwhelm your team if you try to write all that code yourself. You need to focus on your value add if you're a startup.
Fantastic advice all around. This conversation is recorded and will be shared out afterwards. I should have said that at the beginning. I know that this is some of the information here is incredibly valuable. It's also valuable. It's also very dense. And as somebody who is very dense myself about some of these issues, I appreciate the ability to come back around and review it. So yes, we will make it available to everyone here. The SOC 2 point is incredibly well taken. So we only have a few minutes left. Please do put additional questions in the Q&A if you have questions. I think this is such an important and sort of complex topic with lots of different elements. One aspect of it that I'd love to double click on is the AI piece. Just because, partially because I love talking about AI, but also because I think we're at a moment where AI is both incredibly relevant for, as you said already, making the data talk to itself, talk to each other in smooth ways, helping with schemas, helping the data work. But it's also important in that having AI inside an EdTech company often demands more and more data to be brought in to be able to be processed for predictions, for personalization, for all sorts of things. So I'd love to each of you to address how you're thinking about how AI is changing the rostering space. Stephanie, can I start with you again on that?
Sure, absolutely. I talked a lot about attendance data today, being able to really take in all of that information and process it into a recommendation or a suggestion, or groups of students that are in the same situation where you can really scale, understanding that data and action associated with it. I think of AI as it's so exciting, and it's going to grow so quickly and change how we do things so quickly. We think about being able to utilize that data to build efficiency for our districts and be able to help them understand what action to take with that data, because there is so much of it. And so I see AI as being a really useful tool in that way, and not just for rostering, but in lots of other ways. In Talking Points, we have a couple of AI driven features. Our favorite is one we call Message Mentor, that essentially says, okay, this communication you're about to send, if you were to send it to your mentor, what would they tell you to change about it? And we can do that for um, our users. So that's really exciting. I think we're going to see a lot of things like that, where you can help help make your work more efficient, and be able to really, really focus on the action.
David, let me pass it to you, and then Mick, I know you have tons of thoughts about this, but David, I'd love to hear your thoughts on AI in this space.
So AI and security is really huge, right? I mean, you could basically say that we're an AI company. Um, we use AI primarily to deliver, student safety and mental health services. But before I talk about any of that, I have to say first that privacy and transparency are the most important things when it comes to making these AI decisions. Like, we have to balance the privacy and capabilities argument, right? And we have to be extremely transparent to districts and parents about how the AI is being used and what the AI is doing, right? We use AI all across our stack. I think I talked already today about how, we're using AI technology to onboard smaller districts so that we could get those extra data fields without, like, having to hire literal engineers to help every customer assemble their systems. But we also use this data feeds in other ways, right? Like, so we have an AI conversational agent platform, a chat platform that is competitive against like Google Gemini and ChatGPT that, we provide schools for free. And that chat platform, for example, uses this data to identify, okay, this is the student I'm speaking to, and this is their teacher, and this is what classes the student's in. Oh, the student is asking me a question about History 302, and then we can then feed all of those chats back to the teacher through their classroom management interface, so that the teacher is like trying to manage their classroom while their kids are talking to AI about the assignment. The teacher can look at the transcripts for each of the students' conversations and make sure they're on task, make sure they're using AI appropriately. And then we can wrap all that data up into a transparency dashboard that we provide to district and state leaders, where we say, okay, these are the classes that students are really engaging in AI conversations with. These are the classes they're not. And then we have an entire like different flight of AI technologies going on where, one of the great things about AI that people don't talk about, where it really helps privacy, is that if a robot, is reading these documents, no human has to. So a human is never aware of your private data, right? So one of the cool things is that we do have a suicide prevention program, which I'm very proud of. I mentioned it earlier. And one of the things that we do is we look for suicide letters, right? So, there is an AI that reads every Google Doc that the kids write in their Google document spaces and just makes a determination. Is this a goodbye letter, or is this assignment on suicide in Romeo and Juliet, right? It has to make that decision. And because of that, no human has to ever become aware of the student's private thoughts, but still a machine can look at it and then raise the red flag, get help to the student immediately if the student is about to make a decision that can't be undone, right? I could talk about this, could be its own webinar, honestly. So I got to shut up, because otherwise I'll just run my mouth for the next hour.
Well, we can find another time for another webinar on it, because it is incredibly interesting. Mick, tell us
Yeah.
about AI in addition.
Yeah, I'll just give you a 60-second context, which is we think of it in a few buckets. One is how do we get data from these disparate systems, these SIS systems, more quickly, and how do we shape that data into common standards, right? That's a key thing we want to do. Second key bucket is how do we make this integration smoother, frictionless, faster for companies like Securely and Talking Points. And last thing I'd say is again, there's an insatiable demand right now for things like extended data and augmentations. versus just that slim, what we used to call the core rostering data. That's table stakes. We're lowering the cost there as well. That's a key point of what we're doing. But AI is coming in, helping us do all of those things. And I think we're going to see some really great innovations, over the next few years, really, on how we make the data pipes better, faster, smoother, doing data transformations easier, those types of things.
Um, I'm sharing the wrong link in the chat. I apologize for that. Mick, can you also talk us through this slide? Because I think it's a great bookend to where we started, talking about what rostering is and then sort of how Ednition touches each of the steps.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity, Alex. So we launched our platform, Roster Stream, that really focuses on these areas. Sounds like some folks may be interested to chat. We'll obviously do a follow-up, and welcome to book time with me. After this webinar, you know, again, going back to those things, we kind of split it into, yes, core rostering. We want to lower those costs. You're going to run into SSO services out there. Every district has something different. You want to integrate with the learning management systems, right? As Stephanie mentioned and David mentioned, you're going to need to deal with extended and augmented data. And one thing that sets us apart, again, competing on service, we have something we call roster care. Our job is to help you connect to districts and maintain those connections and do it in a way that is private labeled. So again, our system becomes your infrastructure, just like your AWS, cloud hosting or Azure hosting. We're behind the scenes. We're the software that just runs that, so you can have that relationship with those customers and really, to bookend it, reclaim that rostering and integration, and cut and save money doing it, cut those costs.
Absolutely. It's yeah, I when I first met Mick, just a little personal note here. When I first met Mick, we were at a conference and I came up to him and said, "Oh, what's Ignition about?" And we were chatting and he mentioned that he was one of the founders of Mastery Connect, absolutely legendary company in the ed tech space. He mentioned that in passing at the beginning, now bought by Instructure, and he's like, "I am out to really make the ed tech system better by helping people avoid taxes, the fees and taxes. I put it all together." And I could tell within 10 seconds of talking to him, I'm like, this person knows more about data pipelining and ed tech than anybody I've ever met. Truly. And that is sort of direct line to what we're doing here, trying to help the entire ecosystem sort of level up together, whether you're a scaled
That's
company,
right.
whether you're a startup. We all need to know this stuff and we all need to follow it as it continues to evolve.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited for what Ignition is doing, and I'm excited about what OneRoster did, excited about what lots of people are doing. But this is truly a moment where I think data is the fuel behind almost everything we do, and what Securely is doing, what Talking Points are doing with data is can be life changing. So I thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us today. We are right at the top of the hour. As mentioned, we will send out the recording of this webinar, and please give us feedback if you have a chance in the link in the chat, which should be the correct one now. This has been absolutely a blast. I know it's a great webinar when I feel like I've learned a huge amount and I want to go walk away and say, okay, I want to put all these pieces together in terms of all the startups I consult with, all the different ways that we can move it forward. I hope everybody else feels that same way, where your brain is tickling because you're like, oh, I finally can put all the pieces together of this really complicated and fast evolving space. So I want to thank you all so much for being here, and especially thank to our panelists, to Mick Hewitt, CEO of Adnition, to David Hinkle, distinguished engineer at Securely, and Stephanie Kaufman, who is product lead. Is that right? Product lead at Talking, head of product at Talking Points. Thank you all so much for being here with us. And again, I'm Alex Sarlin from EdTech Insiders. Thank you. Have a great weekend and rest of your day.